Well, welcome to our video on percents for the lower intermediate grades, fourth graders, maybe advanced third graders. The intent of this video is to get you acquainted with percentage and percents and help you to see the relationship between percents and decimal fractions. Okay, if we take a look at this grid with 100 little squares on it, I have shaded in 80 of them, so we might call that the fraction 80/100ths. We also know that we could show it in the form of a decimal fraction as 0.80. Now I'm going to change it to a percent. All I do is drop the decimal point off and put a percent sign on. It's really that simple. Well, almost that simple. Let's take a further look. Percent is based on hundredths. That's why I could easily change hundredths into percents. For instance, here I have shaded in 3 bars, and there's 10 of them all together, so that would be 3/10 of the grid is shaded in. We also can take a look at these as hundredths too, because each tenth has 10 hundredths. So if we have 3/10, that equals 30 hundredths. Once we have it in the form of hundredths as a regular fraction, can easily show that as a decimal fraction, and then it's easy to change it to a percent. You can see what I did. Once it's in the hundredths place, just drop the decimal point, put the percentage sign in, and that calls it hundredths, calls it percents, the same thing. Now, if 3/5 is shaded, which I'm doing right now, if we're going to find out what percent of the whole grid is shaded, then we're going to have to change 3/5 into hundredths. Well, we've practiced doing that before with equivalent fractions. And because 3 times 20 equals 100, 5 times 20 equals 100, 3 times 20 equals 60. So we now have that fraction in the hundredths place where we want to have it if we're going to change it into percents. Okay, we write that as a decimal fraction, and then we can proceed on to writing it as a percent. Once again, the two of these are exactly the same as far as the number value goes, but this drops the decimal to become a percent, and the percentage sign goes in instead. Well, look what I did to the grid this time. The whole thing is shaded in. That's all 100/100ths. Well, what percent would that be? Well, it's one whole written as a decimal, showing that there isn't anything over in the decimal places. We could write it like this so that we get to the hundredths place, and now you can probably figure out what the percent is. If it's the whole thing, we usually already know that it would be 100%. Drop the decimal point, put in the percentage sign, and then 100% means all of it, everything. Well, let's see if you can do this. This is a different approach to it. Can you name a percent value that is greater than 1/4 and less than 2/3? Well, it's a little difficult when you're first starting out with percents to easily see what those percentages might be. It becomes a lot easier if you make the transition or the change from the fractions that you're given here to fractions that have 100 as the denominator, if that's possible. In the lower intermediate grades, it is possible. For all the problems that you're presented with do have that relationship between the denominators of the fraction that you're given and a denominator, the hundredths denominator. So you can see that 1/4 equals 25/100ths, maybe you already knew that. And 2/5 equals 40/100ths, because once again 5 times 20 is 100 and 2 times 20 is 40. Now that we see these as hundredths, we could probably easily in our mind change them. This is 25%, this is 40%. So the answer would be anything higher than 25%, which 26 is higher, the first one higher, and all the way up to the one just below 40%, 40 100ths. So everything in between would follow what it's asking you to accomplish here. The percents would be greater than 1/4, but less than 2/5. How about this one? Less than 4/5, because that's the larger of the two fractions, and greater than 3/10. Well, let's do the same thing once again. If we can change 3/10 to 30 100ths, just multiplying both of those by 10, and once again 5 times 20 and 4 times 20. Now that we have them and we can see them as hundredths, we know percents are hundredths too. We need the percent that's just a little bit larger than 30%, and all the way up to the percent that's just 1% smaller than 80%. So this would be the range of percents that we could put in to correctly give the response to this particular problem. When you find a percent of a group, like someone might say, well, 25% of the population wears glasses, something like that. When we want to find that out, in early intermediate grades, this is how we'll go about accomplishing it. Say we needed to find 10% of something, and we wanted to know what that number was. In this particular case, we have a big group of 70, and what we want to find is what 10% of 70 is. How many is that? Okay, well, the first thing we'd want to do is change 10% to a fraction, because we know how to find fractions of groups. So 10 100ths simplified becomes 1/10, and 1/10 of 70 is 7. Remember how we did that? We would split up the 70 into 10 equal parts by dividing it by 10, and so that would make each tenth the value of 7. If we're only looking for one of those groups, of course, that would be just plain old 7. So we now know that if 1/10, which is the same thing as 10% equals of 70 is 7, then 10% of 70 is 7. Okay, how would we do this one? Well, pretty much the same way, but we've got to be able to represent this as a fraction. Well, we know percents are hundredths, so 5% is 5 hundredths. So once we know that, we can just simply follow along with our knowledge of fractions, and we can simplify it. You know, both of these are divisible by 5. We know that because they end in 5 and 0. So 5 divided by 5 leaves 1, 20 divided by 5, 100 divided by 5 leaves 20. And then we do a fraction of a group problem. 1/20th of 60 is 3, because 60 divided by 20 is 3, and we're only talking about one group. So we now know that 5% of 60 is also 3. Well, what happens when we have a situation like this? This is a harder one, and it fools a lot of people when they first encounter them. So we're asking the question, what percent of 25 is 20? Well, that's a difficult one, and it's hard to figure out. There is a way of doing it when you get into the upper intermediate grades. It'll be a little bit different, and some people, actually, you'll think when you get to it that's actually easier. But the way we're going to do this one is to make a fraction out of this. This is the group, the large group, so that's going to be the denominator of the fraction, and this is the part, so that's the numerator. So the fraction becomes 20 20ths. Now, we can change that. Now we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to change the fraction to a fraction that has hundredths, and once we know what that is, then we know the percent. Well, you can see that this fraction, 20 out of 25, changed to the fraction with hundredths as the denominator as 80 hundredths, so that's going to be 80%.